We are on Daf Zayin Amid Beis, which is 16b, and we're in the midst of the Gemara that is the Mishnah has spoken about the various ways of making a wall out of either posts or lavud being lavud being a wherever there's less than 3 tefachim gap in the material. So you have some solid material, whether it's a rope, a string, it could be it could be wood, metal, whatever it is. You have a solid, and then you have a gap of less than 3 tefachim. Let's say 9 inches, and then you have another solid. So that's halachically considered as if it's closed. That's the concept of lavud. Now, the Gemara proposed. So the Mishnah proposed that if you have 3 such gaps that are less than 3 tefachim, so you're 8, almost up to 9 tefachim, and then you have as your solid between each one of these gaps, you have a rope that is a little more than 1/3 of a tefach thick each one. So then you would total of 10 tefachim, it would be sufficient. The Gemara said, what do you need that for? We know that we learned another concept, that if you have ruba oimed, if you have the majority standing, a solid wall, you can have a minority amount that is parrots, that is open. And if you say that whenever you have less than 3 tefachim, it's as if it's solid, it's as if it's enclosed, well then have a gap of 3 tefachim twice, which would mean that you have a solid amount of 2 such gaps that are solid, which means a total of 6 tefachim. And then you're allowed to have a gap of 4, because even though lavud doesn't apply, because it's more than, it's 3 tefachim or more, and therefore lavud, it doesn't make it enclosed. That's true. But we know that if the majority is enclosed, so the minority is allowed to be open. And since halachically less than 3 tefachim is a non-existent gap, well then you have 2 non-existent gaps totaling 6 tefachim, so that's solid. And then you would have a total of 4 open, and that would be sufficient because 6 is more than 4, which means that there's a greater amount that's solid than you have in open. That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara now is asking, what would be that scenario? What does that look like? And the Gemara says, what this looks like is, it can't be that the gap of 4 is going to be at the bottom, because then goats can get through, and that would make it as if it is a non-solid. It would make it that it doesn't count as a proper a proper opening, a proper enclosure. I mean, because the gap at the bottom, goats can get through. It can't be at the top, because we learned another halacha, which is that if you have on the 2 sides of a solid, you have a gap that's larger than the solid. So you have airspace on one side and airspace on the other, and they are larger, each one alone or combined, than the center solid. Asavir the high, the airspace on either side comes and swallows up that solid, and it's as if it's not there. So the only way that we can do this would be if you had the top 3 tefachim, less than 3 tefachim. So you have a lavud at the top, and you have a lavud at the bottom where it's less than 3 tefachim, and those 2 are considered enclosed and solid. And then you have a gap of 4 in the middle, and that should be sufficient. That's where we ended yesterday. The Gemara is proposing, why can't we say, why did the Mishnah have to say that you have 3 gaps of less than 3 tefachim, and the rope is thick enough that it combines to the remaining 1 plus tefach, and that's how you get a solid wall of 10 by making ropes across. Why do we need that for? Why can't we say that 2 of those gaps are 3 tefachim, and 1 gap is actually and 1 gap is a full 4 tefachim? And even though you don't have lavud, but the majority is standing based on lavud, the majority is solid based on the concept of lavud enclosing, and then you can have a minority that's open. Is that clear? Anyone?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay, good. So then we're going to move to the next question that the Gemara is going to bring up. And that is, we have a gap now. What we're saying is the bottom part is less than 3 tefachim, and therefore it's as if it's solid. The top part is less than 3 tefachim, and therefore it's as if it's solid. The center is going to be 4 tefachim, which is not as if it's solid because it's beyond the 3 tefachim, which are the allowance for lavud, making it as if it's solid. However, it's okay because I have a total of 6 standing wall and of solid wall and 1 gap. Less than that, it's going to be okay. However, the gap is 4 tefachim. Each solid wall on the side of it, which is only halachically solid, it's a gap. You can put your hand through it, but since it's lavud, it's as if it's solid. Great, but that's 3 tefachim at the top, 3 at the bottom. That means that the gap is larger than each one of the sides. Only combined, it's smaller. And we saw earlier machlokas of whether or not that's sufficient. Do we say that in such a case that's sufficient to say you have a majority standing, or do we say no, your gap is bigger than either one of the solids, and therefore it's not a valid solid? And let's prove from your question, the fact that you asked this question, that you hold that that's sufficient. So that's where we're up to. Shmas mina. Amid meruba al aparts. If you have a solid standing more than the breach, mishtei ruchos, but it's only solid on account of that it's combined from the 2 sides of the gap. But each one of the sides alone is smaller than the gap. Hava oimet, that counts as a majority standing. And since we have not yet concluded that question, so therefore we don't want to say that that's the meaning of the question. So rather, Rav Amnuna's question is based on this. This person brought a machzeles, which is a reed mat, that is 7 tefachim tall. Well, not tall. It's the length of the wall, but it is only 7 tefachim high. Now, 7 tefachim is not enough. You need 10. But what you did was you hung it on the wall as a fence with a gap of just shy of 3 at the bottom. So if this is 7 and a little bit, and this is and the bottom gap is a little less than 3, so the bottom gap is enclosed on the basis of lavud. The top is going to be a fence, so that would be sufficient, and that everybody would agree it's okay. However, you needed some of this mat reed, and so what you did was you cut out a section from that 7 tefachim. So essentially, you just made a fence out of a reed mat. That's the solid fence is only 7 tefachim plus a little bit. However, it's valid in any case on account of that you put it you started from the top at 10 tefachim, and you brought it down to just below 3 tefachim from the ground. And since it's 3 tefachim, goats can't get under. We have a case of lavud. and it's as if it's entirely enclosed 10 tefachim. But you cut out a section of 3 tefachim at the bottom end of the fencing of the reed mat, and you basically created a window there to the length of the wall with a little bit of mat remaining at the end, and a window of just shy of 3 tefachim. So you've created a lavud within the mat itself. So you now have 7 solid wall at the top, of which there is a 3 tefachim gap, which counts as lavud. Just less than 3 tefachim counts as lavud. And beneath that, there's a lavud. And that should be enough that we have 4 solid at the top, 3 lavud, plus another 3. Why didn't the Mishnah say such a case? So 4 and a little bit remains at the top of the reed mat, and he put it on with less than 3 tefachim gap at the bottom. And that's the case that we could have said in the Mishnah. We didn't have to say a case of 3 ropes that combine. That's the Gemara's question. Rav Ashi says, actually, the question of Rav Amnuna was about a hanging mechitza, a hanging wall, which we saw earlier, that in regards to water over a river. Somebody lives and they have a house right over a waterway, stream, a river, the sea, whatever their porch or their house is over. And on a Torah level, the water is not a public domain, right? It's not 16 amma wide, servicing 600,000 people as a road between intercity or from one end of the city to the other. It doesn't have the qualifications as a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa, a Torah level public domain. But it's also not a private domain, and it does service the masses. And therefore, Chachamim gave it the halacha of a Carmelis, which is a rabbinic public domain, as it were, so where you're not allowed to carry. Now, but the person wants to get water for their house from this waterway. So what can they do? So they can make a hole in the off the porch, take a ledge off the porch, or make a hole in it, and make walls coming down from that ledge, and those mechitza teluya, those walls that are hanging from above over the waterway, is sufficient to count as an enclosure over the waterway below, and you could lower a bucket and bring water up through that way. Chachamim, who enacted that this counts as a public way, as a Carmelis, allowed for such a opening called mechitza teluya. And the question is that true even in another type of mechitza teluya, hanging wall, such as in a ruin, a building that's collapsing? The bottom of the wall has disintegrated, but the top of the wall is still standing. Does that count as enough of a wall that we'd say mechitza teluya, a hanging wall, comes down and counts as a proper barrier? Just as Rav Tavla asked of Rav, mechitza teluya ma'ashetata b'churva in a ruin, does it count as a proper wall? And he answered, no, it does not work. It only works. It's a leniency that the Chachamim made only in regards to water, because of the necessity of water. The leniency is there that if you have a hanging wall, it counts as a wall all the way down. It's a leniency in regards to water, but in other places, a hanging wall would not count, and therefore also this hanging wall in regards to 2 spaces above that are lavud and an empty gap at the bottom, would that count? And the answer is no. Makivim Mekanim. So our Mishnah gave a scenario where you have reeds that are still growing or have been set in, and you have only part of the field has been harvested, and now you have a 10 tefachim wall out of stalks, whether it's reeds or corn or wheat, whatever it may be. you now have a solid wall because between each one of the stalks, it's less than 3 tefachim, and you can have an enormous area like this. So Shiara, a traveling caravan, can encamp within that space. And we saw Rabbi Yehuda says that there is a limit, an individual may not do so. Only a Shiara, a traveling caravan. So Gemara says, "B'shiyara in miyachid lo." Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that an individual may not encamp like this. Why not? An individual may not make any of these barriers that we say for an area larger than 2 sa can be planted, which is 50 by 100 or approximately 70 by 70 amma. This is the area known as the size of the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, Beis Hasayim. That area alone is the area that, if it's not a dwelling space, may be enclosed, and beyond that you're not allowed to carry if the enclosure is larger than that. That's a Beis Hasayim shaloh. It's a makar shaloh kaf ladira. It's not enclosed for dwelling. That's not going to count. So Kedamar Rav Nachman v'Tamer Rav Beva bar Abaye le'nitzach alelita lem kol tzarka. That you're right. When Rabbi Yehuda said Shiara is going to be different, a caravan is going to be different than an individual, that means in a caravan, regardless of how large the space is, it counts as a valid enclosure. But for an individual, up to 2,000, up to 2 sa of grain planting, meaning up to the 70 by 70 amma, that's going to be valid. Beyond that, it's not. And the question is only to give them all the space they need, which for a caravan is going to be okay, for an individual not. And where was Rav Nachman said? On this teaching, the Tanakh we learned every enclosure, every barrier at the end of your carrying space that isn't made of both a shesi ve'erev, both a vertical and horizontal post. That's not a valid mechitza. It doesn't count, like we saw in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says. However, the Chachamim disagree. And then, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, so the Gemara said, challenged, wait, did Rabbi Yosef Yehuda really say that it's not a valid enclosure and a wall if it's a shesi or erev, if it's either vertical or horizontal? It has to be both. Vatani, we learned this rope idea that the Mishnah said that you can have a gap less than 3 and then a rope. That's let's say a third of a little more than a third of a tefach, and then a gap of less than 3 and a third of a tefach, a gap of less than 3, a third of a tefach. Combined, you have 3 less than 3 gaps, which is lavud, plus more than a tefach worth of rope, totaling 10 tefachim, and that counts as an enclosure, like we said in our Mishnah. That rope idea is both for a caravan and for an individual. So what distinction is there? For an individual, you can only make such an enclosure up until 2 seah measure, which is this 70 by 70, approximately 70 by 70 amma. Shnayim, if there are 2 people there, also, you only get this size of 2 seah. Gimel, but once there are 3 people together, Nasa Shayar, now they're a caravan. Rabbi Yosef says each one alone now has the right to a Beis Hasayim. So each one gets their own 100 by 50 or 70 by 70, and therefore you're allowed 6 seah measures. The Chachamim disagree. They say echad yachid ve'echad shiara, an individual or a caravan, no difference. We give them the total amount that they need. Whatever they need, they will get. As long as 2 seah is not beyond what their needs are, that are completely open. that's what Rav Nachman or Rav Beva said, that the Chachamim say no, you can give them as much as they need. A sheyara can that even an individual can have as much as they need, even beyond a base society. This is a valid enclosure, and therefore it works. So we have two places. We have Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the leniencies of having this natural reeds or corn stalks wall is only going to be for a shiara, not for an individual of a beis asayim, if it's larger than this planting measure, which we said 70 by 70, and his son Rabbi Yosef Yehuda said that it's only valid if it is both vertical, horizontal, if it's larger than that space. And the Chachamim say no, there is no such limit, and it's not specifically to a sheyara, it's not specifically to a caravan, it's even individuals, because this is a proper enclosure. Darash Rav Nachman Shrei de Shmuel. Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, Yachin Noisel Beis Asayim, an individual gets a two-seah area, which we said is 70 by 70. Base, two people are traveling together and encamped in this place. Who Beis Asayim also get two. Gimel, but once there's already three, Nasa Shiyar then they get a 6, 2 for each. So the Gemara challenge Shavkis Rabbanu V'Avodas Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Shmuel, you're teaching Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel. You're teaching according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, and not like the majority opinion of the Rabbanan. Other Rav Nachman Amar. So Rav Nachman announced that he's teaching again. V'Dorash, and he had someone speak in his name. Dvarim shamarti lefnechem toisem biyadi. That which I had said in front of you, I was mistaken. Baram kachamru. Rather, this is the halacha. Yachin esel beis asayim, that an individual gets two seah. Shnayim esel beis asayim, two people get two seah measure. Shlosha nasa sheyara. But once they're three, they're a caravan. And they get as much as they want, as much as they need. There's no limit of a two seah for a sheyara. Now we go to Yud Zayin Amud Aleph to 17.8. So Reish Rabbi Yosef Yehuda v'Sefer Rabbanan. Wait. So they said now it's even worse. Before at least you were consistent with Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, and now you've turned it into a combo. The first two statements you said, if there was a single person traveling, or two people traveling, that is a beis asayim alone, and you don't give them whatever they need. But the Chachamim hold that even an individual gets as much space as they need. Therefore, that is in concurrence with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. And yet, at the end, you say if you have three, which is a sheyara, which is a caravan, then you can give them as much as they need. That's the opinion of the Rabbanan. So now you made it into a combo. So he said yes, because actually Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda and his father are, in regards to an individual, say that you cannot have this wall that isn't both horizontal and vertical. It only has the vertical posts, the reeds, right, the growing stalks, and it's not a caravan. So since you have both of these opinions combined, I was strict on the individual. But if you have a majority, if you have a group, a caravan of three or more, then the halacha is indeed you can get as much as you need. Amar Rav Gidl Amar Rav. So Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav that according to Rabbi Yehuda, that there's a limit for an individual. It is possible that sometimes it would be permissible to have 7, but prohibited to have a 7 saw measure, but it would be prohibited to have a 5 saw measure. So Gemara says, how can that be? Amar Rav Shlosha b'chamesh, 3 people traveling in 5 would be prohibited. and they're enclosed in a 5 seah area. That would be prohibited. And b'sheva mutarin. And if it was in 7 seah measures, it would be permissible. Amar Rav Hachi Amar. Amar Leisi said to him, Amar Rav Hachi, did Rav really say this? Amar Luhusi responded, Araisa Navi Eksiva, like the Torah, Naviim and Kesuvim. Yes, he said it. The Amar Rav Hachi, that's what Rav said. Amar Ravashi, my cushion. So Ravashi said, why is that so surprising to you? I can explain it. Dilma Hachi Kama, perhaps this is what he said. If they actually need the 6, meaning that each one's dwelling in their own Beis Hasayim, in their own 100 by 50 amma or 70 by 70 amma. So great. So then they need each one of these spaces, and you have 3 people. So you don't have a barren, open Beis Hasayim, 100 by 50, and therefore it's going to be okay. Vekefa b'sheva, even though that you have 7 seah measures, which means that you have 1 measure beyond what each one's allowed and each one is using, but that's only 1 more, and you're not allowed 2 seah measures more. Aval b'sheva mutar, afil b'sheva mutar, so therefore it's going to be permissible. Lo yehutzuch ela l'chamish. However, if they don't need even 5, meaning they're dwelling within the area of within the area of one space or 2 spaces, seah spaces, and you have a full 2 seah open beyond there. And then you had 7. Now you have 2 full measures of seah measures, to a Beis Hasayim, a 2 seah measure, which is 70 by 70 or 100 by 50, open, that isn't being used, and that will invalidate the entire enclosure, because you have within the enclosure an area that doesn't count as is not allowed to be enclosed. So therefore you're not allowed to carry even in the space of 5. But we said, so this that it means that you should not have 2 seah empty. Wouldn't that mean my love panim that there isn't a person that can dwell there? That means you're not using it at all. Of course, if people are using it, if somebody put his vessels there or himself, he put his tent there, so then it would count. But if everybody's in one area and you have 2 seah open, it's going to invalidate the entire enclosure. Itmar, Shalish, the Ishlosha. They started off with a caravan of 3. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though that he doesn't allow an individual to carry within this type of enclosure, but as a caravan, they're allowed to have this large enclosure of 6 or 7 seah measures. And then one of them dies on Shabbos. Or they started off with 2, and somebody came in and joined them in the middle of Shabbos. And one added. So Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak. We have machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak. One says Chadam Shabbos Goremes, at the opening of Shabbos, at the entrance of Shabbos, that defines the halacha for the rest of Shabbos, regardless of what changes happen in the middle of Shabbos. And Chadamar Diyurin Garment. And one says no, it's actually how many people are dwelling there on Shabbos. 1 left or 1 passed away, you can no longer carry within that space. Somebody joined, you can carry within that space. Let's prove that Rav Huna is the one that says at the onset of Shabbos, that's what defines the space for the rest of Shabbos. Rabbi said that Rav Huna, the question was asked of Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, and the question was asked of Rav Yehuda. Irev Derech HaPesach, 2 courtyards that are neighboring to each other, and they have a doorway between their courtyards, and they made an Eruv, meaning they made a joint meal. And they said the families and the households that live in courtyard A are going to be able to carry back and forth with the families that live in courtyard B by this joint meal that they made. And now on Shabbos, something happened, and that doorway became unusable. The wall collapsed, and there's a pile of stone there, whatever it may be. Now that's no longer an opening, but there is a window opening between them. And now they want to pass stuff between one window and the other and carry. But the original opening is not there. And so they no longer are a shared courtyard through that doorway. Or if they made a joint courtyard through the door, through a window, and that window became unusable. So Mahu, what is the halacha? Do we count and say, you know what, at the onset of Shabbos, they were allowed to carry from one to the other, so nothing changes? Or do we say, no, right now you can't use it, so there's no joint space, and therefore you cannot carry from one to the other? V'amarli, and Rav Huna responded, Shabbos Shabbos at the onset, once it started as a permissible to carry, it remains that way for Shabbos. Testayim, so that seems good proof that Rav Huna is the one that holds that at the onset of Shabbos, that defines the space for Shabbos, and therefore if you had 3 there at your caravan, it counts as space you're allowed to carry, and even according to Rav Yehuda, and it would not be valid to, and if one dies, it would not invalidate it. And the other way around, if you didn't have enough, and then somebody joined on Shabbos, it would not be sufficient. Lema Rav Huna Rav Yitzchak bepluted Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda. Let's say that this machlok is between Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak, whether we go at the onset of Shabbos or at the entire time, based on how many dwellers are there or what type of dwelling you have, is the same as Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda disagreeing in a Mishnah. And that would be a problem, because why would we need a machlokas of Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak on something that's already in a Mishnah? The Tanan, as we learned, we have a courtyard. There was a breach on 2 sides of the courtyard. This is a Gemara later. The Gemara is going to explain what that scenario is about. But what we're going to see machlokas in regards to the change on Shabbos. Or a house that 2 sides of it has an opening, a breach that open. Or you have an alleyway which has 3 walls, and we've seen at the beginning of Masechta, you need either a vertical post or a horizontal post, and whatever you put there, the lechi or the korah, was removed on Shabbos. Mutarin la'isa Shabbos, v'asurin la'asad lavid Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that Shabbos you can continue carrying because you had a proper enclosure at the onset of Shabbos. It fell on Shabbos, okay, but at the onset it was okay, and you're allowed to continue carrying. However, Rabbi Yossi says, no, in mutar l'asa Shabbos, mutar l'asa lavi. If it's permissible for this Shabbos, it should be permissible forever. And it's not permissible forever, ve'masur l'asa lavi, and since it's prohibited forever, asurim l'asa Shabbos, it's also prohibited on this Shabbos as well. You don't have any proper enclosure. So lema Rav Huna d'Amakar Rav Yehuda. So Rav Huna, who says that we look at the onset of Shabbos, whether this counts as a caravan or not. So too over here, we look at whether this alleyway was enclosed or the courtyard was enclosed at the onset of Shabbos. But Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak says like Rabbi Yossi. Amalacha Rav Huna, so Rav Huna says no. There's a distinction. I would agree even to Rabbi Yossi in that case. Adkan lekam Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi over there is talking about hasam ela delesnu lemechitzos. There, the actual barriers, the walls collapsed, so you don't have an enclosure. Of course, it doesn't make a difference what it was at the onset of Shabbos. Right now, you don't have enclosure; you can't carry. But in our case, you have the walls, you have the stalks as a proper wall. It's just that we're lenient in that in regards to a caravan. But you have the enclosure. One of the people died, so it doesn't count as a caravan. But at the onset of Shabbos, you were allowed to carry. You can continue carrying. Rabbi Yitzchak says the reverse. Another Amri Afilu Rabbi Yehuda. I would say even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that even though I don't allow to carry by the caravan because one of the people died, but I would allow it in the case of the alleyway that the wall, that the cross beam or the vertical post collapsed. Rav Yehuda allows it because the same dwelling people are there. The dwellers are there. Some of the demarcations fell, but the dwelling's the same, and they had at the onset of Shabbos made a joint space, a joint meal, so that remains. But over here, one of the 3 of the caravan died. It's not a valid space. The Chachamim say no. You can have either a vertical or horizontal. It doesn't have to be both, and it counts as a valid enclosure. Hainu Tanakama. Well, that's exactly like the first opinion said. So why do we need the Chachamim to disagree at the end as well? The distinction is that the Chachamim don't only allow it in regards to a caravan or individual traveling, but even an individual in the city can have an enclosure that is either vertical or horizontal, and that's going to be sufficient. It doesn't have to be specifically out in the field, a traveler, whether it's an individual or a caravan, in any manner, that's going to be okay. The next Mishnah tells us the leniencies that the Chachamim made for things that are rabbinic obligations or prohibitions that were lenient for soldiers out in a military camp. Arba devarim patru b'machane. There are 4 things that the Chachamim were lenient on rabbinic obligations or prohibitions for soldiers in the camp, such as mevi'in eitzim mikol makom. 1, you're allowed to bring wood from anywhere. So for the military camp, they can take wood from anywhere. And we'll see in the Gemara where that's from. And they are exempt of washing the hands for tuma, for teruma, umedamai, and they're exempt of demai, which is when you purchase produce from the marketplace and you're not sure whether or not the seller took tithes. So you're allowed. So you have to take tithes, but it's a rabbinic obligation because you have a reason to assume that he did, and therefore, because he said he did, and people tithe usually, and so you're allowed to. So soldiers can be lenient, and they don't need to make an eruv, a joint meal between each other, even though that you have multiple people, and that should require within the encampment an eruv, a joint meal. They don't have to make it a joint meal. So Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa taught that a military camp going out to war, but it's not an obligatory war, which is the wars of entering Eretz Yisrael, but rather Mechemes HaRashus. It's a war that was not necessary in the sense of it's a mitzvah, the original inheritance of the land, but rather later on, whether it was regardless of how it started, there's a war, and it's considered a Mechemes Rashus, and a private choice war. Nevertheless, Mutar Begezel Eitzim Yaveshim. The soldiers are allowed to confiscate wood for their encampment. They can also dwell wherever they are. Redcoats coming in, they can dwell where they are. They can take whatever firewood they need for the encampment. And also, where they are killed in the battlefield, that's where we bury them. So Gemara analyze each part of this brisa. They're allowed to take dry wood. Wait, taking wood, that's permissible anyhow, because the Amar, because the Yeshua, as a part of inheriting the land, made a deal with all the tribes and said, this is something that's allowed. All the tribes are allowed to take wood from forests. Namamar, as we learned in the Brisa, Asara Tanoim Hisna Yeshua, there were 10 conditions or agreements Yeshua made with all of the tribes that are allowed. 1, that Marim B'chorshin, that you're allowed to take your animals to pasture in wild overgrowth, even in private property. If it's wild overgrowth and the owner is not maintaining it and cultivating it for his own hay, grass, or whatever, so it's an open field. Even though it's private property, people are allowed to pasture in there. So they're saying, and you're allowed to gather twigs and wood from open fields. Again, these are not cultivated. So the Gemara says, "Hasma his mivihigi." That's talking about twigs and thorns and thistles. But for a soldier encampment, it could be even proper wood. And also over there, it's wood that has not been chopped down, where somebody has taken it for their own firewood. Soldiers can take even by what's already been cut. Also there, it would be wet. So you would have to dry it and take care of it yourself. Soldiers can even take firewood that's already been cut down and dried, and they can take that. They're fighting on behalf of the people. They get the firewood. Rav Yehuda ben Tema says also wherever they are buried, wherever they die, they are buried. Pshita meis mitzvah. This is a meis mitzvah. There's no one taking care of them. They're out in the battlefield, and the halacha is a meis mitzvah. A dead person a deceased person who has nobody taking care of them, they acquire their place as their burial place. And it says afagav the islay kover. So now we're on 17b. For soldiers, the halacha is even if they have relatives that would take care of them, nevertheless they acquire their place out in the battlefield. The time we learn ezu meis mitzvah. What is a meis mitzvah? Kol she'ein b'kover. Anybody that doesn't have a relative to take care of their burial. Kore v'acher moinim. But if he were to call out and somebody would respond, that's not a meis mitzvah. That's a regular burial. And a meis mitzvah really acquires its place. But what about this brisa that taught somebody finds a dead person in the middle of the street? You move him either to the left of the or the left of the right of the street. So they near. Find them between a total barren field and a plowed but not yet planted field. You take them to the barren field. So they near zera, a plowed but not yet planted field, or a field that had already been seeded. They near, move them to the planted not yet planted field. But if they were both planted, both already plowed, or so both already seeded, or both of them were just barren fields. So you're moving whichever way you want. Amar Rabbi said it's true. Usually we say wherever they're buried, you find them, that's where you bury them, and that becomes their marker. However, on a border or on a street, Kohanim go there to check out the fields or to travel, and therefore you can't put them there because then the Kohen is going to be tamei. So you have to move them into where a Kohen would not travel, and therefore you have to move them, and you're going to move them to the most appropriate place. Once you can move them from this border place, you move them to wherever is most appropriate. Soldiers are also exempt of hand washing. Let's talk about the hand washing before eating, which even before Shlomo, which enacted hand washing for all bread, there was an enactment of hand washing for teruma. And therefore the soldiers would wash that, and the soldiers are exempt of that washing. But at the end of the meal, washing on account of the salt that they would touch, that's an obligation, even though it's not a mitzvah, as the Gemara Tues says in the Gemara in Shabbos, that it is a lesser form of obligation than what Chazal say mitzvah or other obligations, but nevertheless, it's an obligation on account of the danger. So that soldiers are obligated as well. What is the reason? Because there's salt from the Dead Sea area that is very strong and can blind the person. And if they didn't have forks and knives, so they would touch the food and dip it into the salt, and the salt would get to their eyes, and it can blind them. And it's one small amount in a large amount of salt, and yet it is a danger. What happens if you're just measuring salt? Does that count? No, then you don't need to wash because it's not a danger. And Tues says also, nowadays, it is not our custom to wash at the end of a meal, because we don't have that salt, this salt from the Dead Sea, as well as because most of us don't dip with our fingers into salt, and therefore it's not a danger, and you don't have to wash your hands at the end of a meal. Our custom is that the Seder night we do wash our hands with mayim achronim on account of that we dip in salt water. Umidamai, and also the soldiers are exempt from taking this tithe of demai. The Tananas we learned machila mesanim demai vesachsania demai. Poor people and guests are allowed to eat demai, since it's a rabbinic obligation, because you probably tithe was taken just because you're not sure to retake it, as it were. And for poor people, we don't make that obligation. And for guests, we don't make that obligation. So too for soldiers. Amar Ravuna, Tana, Beishamai say, no, you may not give demai to poor people or to the guests. You are allowed to. And therefore, according to Basil, also soldiers have this leniency. Umili Arif. And they also don't have to make an eruv, which is a joint meal between all the people dwelling in this encampment. Amr Dever of Yanai, in the name of Yanai, they said, Lashano el eruv chatzeros. That's the courtyard joint meal. They don't have to do. But an eruv, if they want to travel on Shabbos beyond the 2,000 amma, they have to put a meal out there to enlarge their space. The Tana Rabbi Chia, as Rabbi Chia taught, because Rabbi Chia taught that eruv techumin, the limit into how far you're allowed to travel, is a Torah obligation. Maskef la Rav Yonasan. So Rav Yonasan challenged, is that really true? When the Torah says al, thou shalt not, but not in the word lo, do not, but al, which is a lack, is that enough of a prohibition that you would get lashes for? Meaning, is it a proper prohibition? And over here it said al yetze ish mimkomo, a man should not go out from his place. So perhaps that's not enough of a prohibition to require lashes. Therefore, it's not. Therefore, and we can be lenient for soldiers. Well, for sure you do, because if not, it says, "Do not turn to sorcery." There it says it in the word "al," and of course that's a Torah prohibition. Would you even contemplate that you don't get lashes for that? Rabbi Yonasan's question is, but anytime you have a general prohibition that has a Torah level capital punishment, there's no lashes for that, because that would be double jeopardy. Does it say don't carry? Al Yetze Ksiv says do not go out, which is there's no prohibition of carrying. There's a prohibition of traveling, and that's why Rav Chia said it should be a prohibition. You do have to make an eruv for traveling beyond 2,000 am. With this, we complete the first chapter of Eruvin, and we shall come back to you as Hashem Yisbarach.